This week on Casual Watch Talk, we go over our watch obsessions with something we're really hoping that Tudor come out with, and then we'll discuss some common watch collecting myths that we believed when we started out, but then we learned as we went through that they were not quite as we thought. Stay tuned to find out more. Hi everyone, welcome back to Casual Watch Talk podcast. Todd, thanks for joining me again.
Oh, so happy to be here, Sam. Really enjoy having these conversations with you.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for the feedback. We want to do a new segment called Audience Emails or Listeners Emails. If you've got some comments or questions for Todd or I, email the casualwatchreviewer@gmail.com. I'll leave an email in the comment section down below because we'd love to hear from you, and the best ones we will read out on the podcast. Well, let's start with a new segment that I'm bringing back, which is our watch obsessions for the week. So Todd, I'll let you go first, but before we do that, shall we do a wristwatch check before I forget?
Oh, for sure. So I brought back an Old Faithful. This watch I've had for a few years now, and it's just the trusty old Seiko Turtle. But this one I had a very unique dial. I wish I could remember the reference number. I should try to find that. But it doesn't have just a black dial. It's sort of a gunmetal or anthracite dial that looks black, but then when the light hits it, it turns to this really smoky gray. And I have it on a lovely Bark & Jack 1-pass strap. So it's a very comfortable watch as a package. I love it.
Very good. Not a sponsor.
Nope, not a sponsor, but
always
open.
Always open. I'm wearing a G-Shock. This is the recreation, the 5000R, which I think they've sold out everywhere. I managed to do a review of it. This was the recreation of the original G-Shock, the 5000C, the original square. Pretty cool. I did notice that, in fact, on the last couple of G-Shocks, that the LCD, if you tilt them in a certain direction, the battery-powered ones, that they go slightly translucent, and I thought it might have just been something with mine, but I know a few people had commented on that upload that they'd also noticed this. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. So I'll monitor the next couple of G-Shocks that come through and see whether that's the case or not. But essentially, when you're looking at the watch straight on, the LCD has quite a lot of contrast, but if you look at it at different angles, it goes slightly translucent.
Sounds like a very 80s problem to have on that watch. It's just sort of that LCD technology, and maybe that's just the vibe that you always are going to get. The contrast does seem better than I remember the ones I would see as a kid. They're very punchy today, very legible.
And it's funny because I compared it in the video to that Casio World Timer, which is, I think, $35, which is a bargain. I think you can even get one for $20, and that's got an extremely high contrast display. They've done an excellent job of that one.
That one is so great, and it is a wonderful one. I gifted one of those to a young man I know who kind of just got really interested in watches, and so my father had given him this old, really terrible watch he got as a gift from like an insurance company or something like that was cheap quartz. So I found one of those and gave it to him, and he was thrilled. I was like, you can wear this anytime. You can go when you're going fishing or whatever, wear this watch. And he loves that watch, and it's a wonderful gateway drug for young people because it does so much.
I wanted to do that conversion kit, the metal conversion kit. I was going to do an upload on it, but they're quite hard to find now. I don't know why that is. A lot of AliExpress ones are out of stock, and then there was that one site, Seiko Mods, I think, or SKX Mods, but they want over $100 for the metal case, and I don't know whether I want to do it that much. But I remember at one time they were quite plentiful, weren't they? The modded metal cases for them, because they're just a resin case. Mine's painted silver.
Yeah, but I think that watch has become such a darling in sort of the watch collecting community. Like, you see a lot of YouTubers talking about that watch. I know Jody talks about it, I think, like once a year, because it is just such a capable, great. I like to wear that one for travel for sure, because it's so quickly, you can click through the time zones. It's a great watch.
Amazingly light as well, isn't it? Because of that resin case. Now a lot of big watch companies are going to forged carbon cases or titanium to make their watches lighter. There's nothing quite as light as that World Timer.
And the one I got, the model I got for myself, is actually, it's like in a drab army green, but it has a fabric strap, so it's even lighter. It's great.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's dive into our watch obsessions, or watches that have caught our attention this week. Todd, I'll let you start.
Well, mine is one that it's not real yet, but everyone thinks it's going to be real. And I'll reference Adrian Barker on his YouTube channel. He has a predictions for 2025, and it's one that we talked about a year ago when it was at Only Watch, and it's that Tudor Prince that was developed in solid gold. But the kicker was that they put all this money into an in-house movement that's their own. It's not the Breitling shared movement. This is an in-house Tudor movement specifically made for that watch. And the amount of R&D, the amount of time and testing to make all the machinery that's required to make one single movement, everybody went, there's no way they're just doing this as a one-off. There's no way. The fact that this is the 30th anniversary of that Tudor Prince chronograph, I think Adrian's prediction is right on the money, that this would be an ideal year for the Wilsdorf Foundation to put out a reissue of that watch. The only question is what version of it, because there were 3 different styles on the bezel as well. Any one of them would be a gorgeous watch. I'd be excited to see what it would do, because I think the other thing I like about it, as everybody knows, I'm a unabashed Tudor fan, and Tudor gets a bad rap for being, all we do is Black Bay. All they do is Black Bay. They really do have a broader product offering. It's just that the Black Bay seems to be, again, the reviewer darling, but they have this broad product offering, and if they were to add this one, this is yet another, I hope they don't call it the Black Bay. Watch me be wrong on this entire thing, but if they could keep it as the Tudor Prince, that would be phenomenal. It would be just a showstopper.
And this would be, for anybody that's not familiar with the Tudor Prince, there was several ones, wasn't there? Even one that was called the Tiger, was it? Or that was the colour scheme? This is the closest to Tudor's version of the Daytona, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the difference is well, I call it vertical, but it's really not. But it's the registers are all off to the left side of the dial instead of across and down from the 3 to the 9. This is a 12 and 6, and then there's another register at the 9 o'clock.
Yeah, it's a beautiful watch. The funny thing is that a lot of YouTubers make predictions about things, but if any YouTuber was going to get a Tudor prediction correct, probably would be Adrian, wouldn't it? Considering he does have I don't know if it's a commercial relationship with him, but he does have a relationship on the channel with Tudor, doesn't he? I don't think he was leaking anything, but if ever there was a YouTuber that might get a Tudor prediction right, it would probably be Adrian, I would argue.
Yeah, my money's definitely on him having an inside track on that. But I guess we'll see. But I would be excited to see that watch in the wild.
Yeah, I wonder if he'll be like the Daniel Craig of Tudor, where he just accidentally wears one or something.
Perfect.
Well, my watch obsession is definitely on the affordable end. I've just seen Watch Chris got sent all 3 of these in for review, and it was one that was a little bit under the radar, but it seems like Bulliver, who is of course part of Citizen, is having their own play at the plastic case or ceramic composite case, because they have introduced, this must be to rival the Moon Swatch and the 50 Fathoms that Swatch released, because they've released a composite case snorkel watch, which is quartz. It looks amazing, similar to the Devil Diver, which I liked at the time, but then they put one of the very basic 8000 series in it when they first brought it back. But this one looks really cool. They're obviously prepping for summer. There's a couple of really interesting colors. They've got a blue, a red one, a gray one with the blue and the gray dial. They've got a green, fun colors. $350, which you can usually get a little cheeky discount on sometimes on the Bulliver website. I think it's spot on quote.
That and the not secondary market, but the retail market, there will definitely be a price break. That is the factory pricing.
Yeah, I think these are just really fun. They've got that vintage style casing to them. I wonder what the bezel's going to be like. I'm going to wait for Watch Chris's YouTube to come out, but this would definitely be one that I would pick up out of any of them. I would choose this over the 50 Fathoms, and I would choose this over the Moon Swatch for sure if I was looking for a super light plastic cased watch. The only thing is that I sometimes worry about whether these are a little bit cartoonish, but they do have a grey one which looks really subtle, and there's a red one that looks like a lot of fun as well. I think it'll just be seeing these in person, but I think this was a great release from Bulliver. That I don't think they made that much of a song and dance about it, but I thought it was really cool that they did this. So that was my watch obsession for this week.
That one's very cool, and I'm actually curious about, I don't know if you have any details. It looked like it has a stainless steel case back, so unlike a Swatch, is that something that we can actually change the batteries on and maintain and fix
Yeah, you're exactly right. Screw down case back, so you can. This is quartz, so yeah, you absolutely can change the battery on it. And also, I'm guessing because it's got a stainless steel case back, that it must have some kind of stainless steel inner case as well, plasticish outer. They do look as if they're ceramic, so if you wanted to go for a ceramic looking watch on a budget, they do look a little bit like the ceramic cases, which is cool.
Oh, good call. Yeah. We literally just had our last podcast saying we weren't going to do this, and you and I are already both shopping. So we'll see how far you and I get through 2025.
Yeah, well, the Tudor Prince, do you think the Tudor Prince would break you?
Oh, well, it would break me financially. I would have to make, as I said, some moves to get one of those. My speculation is that's going to come in around at 6,000.
I think so. Yeah, they have
Yeah.
to distinguish it from the standard Tudor Chrono, which I think is $5,000.
Yeah.
$5,000 mark. It would be amazing because it's not that blocky case of the current Tudor Chrono, which I like that blocky case, but this is a competitor to the Speedmaster, a competitor to the Daytona that I don't think the standard Tudor Black Bay Chrono really is.
Yeah, I think the release of this, it'll be curious if they maintain both in the catalog for a while, because I think what will happen is and this is just a different prediction. If they release this and it's got that more svelte case and the different movement, they may end up then retooling the Black Bay Chrono and getting it into a little bit smaller case as well. Sort of as the next step.
Do you know if the movement, would it be manual wind or was it an automatic?
There's a rotor on it. Yeah, I noticed that when they showed the movement. It's the same sort of Tudor, not pretty utilitarian looking movement, but they work great. So that's okay. They don't need to be pretty when they work so well.
Definitely one to look out for, I guess, around Watches and Wonders. We'll find that out.
Right. And I did have one more bonus obsession this week, and this is a much more affordable option. And it was one I didn't even have on my radar, so I don't even know if this is a new watch. My son came across it, and it's on sale right now at Long Island Watch, and it is a beautiful integrated looking watch. Forgive me on this reference number. It is the BM7630-80L, but basically it looks like a combination of a Royal Oak and like a Tag Aqua Racer, obviously Eco Drive, and right now $244. This is a very cool looking watch with the waffle dial, and you can't go wrong with the Citizen Eco Drive. So I mean that one's definitely an obsession right now for a guy who wasn't going to buy any watches this year.
For the main subject this week, and I imagine this will probably take us a couple of weeks to go through, but I've been seeing some interesting uploads online which are about the general theme has been watch collecting myths or things that are commonly believed by watch collectors that might, once you get into the hobby, I'd throw debunk's a bit of a harsh word for it, but you definitely, a few things that I believed when I started watch collecting, or a few things that a couple of YouTubers say. We picked a handful. We'll go through them now as we go in. But Todd, did you find this as well when you were starting out watch collecting? There's a couple of things that are commonly believed, but as you get more into it, as you start learning.
I've always kind of enjoyed and had watches throughout my life, and I don't know that I became like this avid collector till a number of years back recently. And there were things that I even thought about my old watches that in retrospect, I'm like, oh, you didn't know, but that you thought at the time, this was state of the art. This is the best you can do. And I remember even, and I think we're going to talk about it, but I remember one of my watches, I bought it. It wasn't cheap. Got it at a department store, but it was a brand name. And my mom wanted to see it right away. She goes, oh, quartz. Very nice. And, and young Todd would, oh, good. I made a good purchase. It's funny that was the sales pitch back then, in the early 80s.
Oh, they were so proud of it, weren't they, putting quartz on the dial? Because it was the revolution. It was the smartwatch of the time, wasn't it? That for years you'd had mechanical watches, and for the most mechanical watches that people could afford, the utilitarian ones they weren't that accurate, the original Timexes and stuff like that. It was the time was more like a guide. I think it was because Rolex, that was their pitch, wasn't it? That their watches were extremely accurate was one of their original pitches.
Well, and that's funny too when you say that, because we take it for granted now because we can look it up at any moment. But I was just reflecting back with my wife the other day, and I remember as a kid, and this is going to make me sound very old, that there was a phone number you could call for time and temperature. And you would set your watch to it. At the tone, the time will be, and it would say it, and you would go, okay, I know the watch time for today. And you'd set your watch every day.
Well,
because they were so wildly inaccurate.
Well, that was it. The same thing in the UK, and it was sponsored by the watch brand Accurists,
Okay.
and their pitch was how accurate the watches were because they were quartz. Ours was, I think it was 123. You would type and it would tell you the time. I think the first myth then has to be that once you get into watches, when you're first into it, quartz is seen as not inferior, but just, I guess, not as prestigious.
Well, there's so many people online in these groups who will just say it just doesn't have any soul, and it's like, well, that is a broad statement. I could say that may be true with maybe a $15 watch you got at Walmart. Okay, but quartz is not quartz is quartz is quartz. There is a broad spectrum. And when you start getting into these high precision quartz movements, now we're talking about something very exciting. And I think every bit is cool. And I do love having a few grab and goes. When you want to change it up and you go, okay, well, I don't have to set this one, so I'll take this one right now. So there's some real benefit to it.
No, I totally agree. Some of the high accuracy quartz movements from Grand Seiko, the 9F, and then the Citizen, that high accuracy Eco Drive, even Breitling with their thermocompensated quartz watches. It really is an interesting avenue to go down, I think, quartz. I've certainly went through that phase of, I've got to go mechanical, but then really warming to quartz. Like, I won't buy a new Seiko mechanical watch in the $1,000 range. I would go straight for quartz, and I do find myself looking at quartz watches more these days.
Oh, I do too. One of my favorites is my Lunar Pilot, the Bulova Lunar Pilot. That's an extremely accurate movement as well. And I'm kind of to a point that, and we've talked about this before, that chronographs by their nature, until you spend a lot of money, are a chunky, heavy watch. And I love a chronograph, and I'm kind of thinking, I think my next chronograph, sorry, Tudor, it's probably just going to be another quartz one, because I love how comfortable that quartz chronograph is on my wrist, and then I like the functionality of the chronograph.
I think the only thing that I don't like about quartz chronographs is the prevalence of the mecha quartz movement with the 24-hour subdial and the 30-minute counter. I don't understand why that's suddenly become a darling of certainly micro brands.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I hate that 24-hour one. That's one of the things I like about the Bulova. It doesn't have that. It has a 1/10 of a second counter where that 24-hour one normally lives. But yeah, I think it must be just because, let's face it, Seiko makes an amazing, robust movement that will last, and it's not expensive. So it's easy for these micro brands to be able to say, like, this is the one we're putting in.
Now let's get into some of the juicy ones, and this was one that immediately came to my mind because it's been fresh in my head from a review that I did recently, was the use of newer watch companies, I'll say, micro brands and newer watch companies, using what they call Hesalite or acrylic. There's other names for it as well, but essentially this acrylic crystal to get a domed effect on a watch. And then there's usually some romance around, Laurier do this, romance about all the warmth of it and stuff like that, but they pay lip service to the maintenance of this material by saying, you can just rub it down with Polywatch, but really there's a lot more to it than that, I think. And I'm getting a little bit turned off by watch companies that promote Hesalite as if it's an advantage over other materials.
I couldn't agree more. I understand why that material was originally used. That was state of the art in the 1920s or 30s, or when those watches all had a plastic crystal. But there's no reason today for it. I've seen all sorts of cool domed crystals made out of mineral glass, which I would far take over a Hesalite or a plastic any day of the week. You can polish them, and we talked about this, but if you get a gouge, you're not polishing that, because you can only polish so far. Every time you're taking off material, it's not like it's rubbing the scratch away. You're rubbing away plastic every time you do it, and the more often you have to do it, the less robust that crystal becomes. Well, I have a wonderful old Jacques Dro that I got from my uncle, and it is like an original, what do you call those divers that compress? Is it a compression diver?
Yeah, compression.
The crystal is destroyed because he used it as a diver for years. I can't even get it replaced. And I want to be able to wear the watch, but it's so scratched, it's almost illegible. Like you can barely see the dial through it. And I go, that's just, and the problem is, because it was a compression, my watchmaker can't find a crystal a sapphire or mineral crystal to replace it because it's a flanged crystal specifically made and it's plastic and there's just nothing to replace it. So I may have to just live with this. I love the watch, but it's going to be just beat up looking no matter what I do.
And you're totally right. Back in the day, there was a reason why they used it. For a start, it's very strong, whereas they were using glass. Sapphire wasn't as prevalent. They were using glass. So it was a lot harder than easily glass that was shatter easier. Also, it did help with the waterproofing, didn't it? Because it would flex and help the seal.
Correct.
And then also it was obviously quite easy to manufacture. And plus, back in those days, we talked about quartz was the future back in those days, but also plastic was the new wonder material back in those days. They were testing it for all sorts of different things, the acrylic, and it is strong. I mean, I had a Speedmaster for years and I did drop it and cracked the acrylic, which I don't know whether a sapphire would have cracked. I mean, I dropped it on a tile, but that's how I know that not only does it scratch easier, but if you accidentally bang it up against a door frame or something like that, the paint transfers onto the acrylic. It kind of sponges the paint up.
Yeah, and I am notorious for bashing doors. I don't. I am like a bull in a china shop every time I'm going through a door jam. So I would destroy one of those. And in fact, it's kind of made me shy away from my vintage collecting because for a minute I had a couple really cool old Seamasters and watches like that, and I just never wear them. I would never wear them because I'm afraid I'm going to bash them. So I've ended up moving them on and went with something more modern because I do really like having the crystal's important to me.
I always think it's funny when I'm reviewing G-Shocks and then Casio watches because Casio watches will readily put sapphire on even the $80 watches. I reviewed one that is about $80 and had a sapphire on it. It was a flat sapphire, so there wasn't any finishing to it. But then G-Shock is very stingy with their use of sapphire, and they put it on the ones that are in the many thousands of dollars. And I make comment of it in the video. A couple of people are like, well, I trust mineral crystal over sapphire. But it's like, yeah, but if the sapphire's a thick sapphire, I think it's going to... It's certainly very scratch proof, but I think it's going to be as shatterproof as an equally as thick mineral crystal, which mineral crystal does scratch. So I always think that's funny that G-Shock are a bit stingy with their sapphire, whereas the parent company Casio will put it on even a $99 watch.
I think the interesting thing though about G-Shock especially is that they're very considered with their case design, and often that crystal is very well shielded and protected. I mean, it would have to take a direct hit, which would be then it would damage it. But they at least understand. I think they clearly understand the weakness of the plastic, and they make sure to protect it. And that's not something you're going to get with any kind of traditional looking watch that you're going to wear, like a chronograph or something like that, where you've got that plastic just sitting loud and proud, waiting to be smashed into something.
Yeah, the crystal, yeah. That was an interesting one. Love to hear your feedback on that. Next one we had, and this is a whole episode in itself, isn't it? But that specs don't tell the whole story. And this is quite tricky to do as a watch reviewer because in many respects, a good watch review or most watch reviews have a breakdown of the specification, the movement. We just talked about the crystal that was used, the depth rating of a watch. Does it have a screw down crown? Does it not? Does the bracelet? So the specs, when you start out collecting, if you're just a specs buyer, then I think you're losing out quite a bit, really, because there's certain things that the amalgamation of the parts don't, or what's the phrase? There's some of the parts don't add up to the.
Oh, right. Yeah, I don't know. I can't think of it. I know I can't come up with it.
Somebody's screaming at their radio now, or it's a radio. No, I'm not on radio.
Not the value worth of some of its parts or something like that.
Yeah, the sum of its part. The value is more than the sum of its parts.
Yes. And the problem is, if you're a spec chaser, you can go down that road of the dupe watches, as we talk about. That Sam is adamantly opposed to. I'm somewhere softening, but I understand why the hesitance, because they are just straight up ripoffs. And I want to come back to that in 1 second. But then you can get some fairly well spec'd watches, but they're just cheap copies of a different watch. Now, I found it interesting on this topic, and you brought it up. I think Walmart has like a dupe of a Burberry bag.
Yeah, the Birkin. Yeah, the Birkin bag.
Birkin bag. That's what it is, Birkin. And then, but they had a whole news segment on all the dupes you can get today, and people are flaunting them. And you go, okay, so this is okay in every other realm, but in watches, this is the top number one sin for the watch collector. So I just find it interesting as a juxtaposition because no one has a problem wearing a dupe Gucci, a dupe Birkin bag, a dupe anything. And again, like I said, just this is devil's advocate conversation, but it is interesting how upset people will get, you in particular, Sam, about that particular practice when it comes to watches.
This is a whole episode in itself, isn't it, about brands that do copy watches, but also the fashion brands that, for the most part, make awful watches. Hermes is not one. Hermes do have quite a good legacy of creating watches, but Gucci, for example, Gucci do have the odd decent watch, but for the most part, they're absolute garbage what they're producing, in my opinion. If you're just going into a Gucci store, but
for sure,
yeah, it is an interesting where the actual line is. But even if you're looking at things, there is watches that are extremely, even main brands that if you were just a specs buyer, you would probably go for them. But for me, it's always about and this is my thing against homage watches is, or I should say copy watches, not homage watches, but why the design? Why was it designed that way? Who first designed it that way? Because you can find the Submariner is a great example, but even the Seiko 62 MAS or these other watches, the reason that they look the way they looked at the time wasn't pure aesthetic choices, was it? They were functional choices of why they did that. And I like that romance. I like that story of researching a watch, like why do they look like that?
I think you've just distilled it in a very good fashion. I think the challenge has become that Submariner is now a fashion watch. Very few Submariners are actually doing what they were originally designed for. They're sitting around boardroom tables and showing everybody that this is how much money I make, is what it's ultimately all it's doing. And I think that's the reason, not that that's a good reason for the dupe, because it's no longer, no one sees it for what you just said. The general public do not see that. They just I want that Rolex. And if I can't afford a Rolex, I want one that looks like it.
It's funny, when I did sales for a long time, like IT sales. And I remember this was sort of early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. And the watch that the sales managers had weren't Rolexes. They were the Seamaster 300s, the James Bond ones. I mean, maybe it's because James Bond was but I always associate that watch not with, obviously, the Brosnan era James Bond I associate it with, but I do associate it with a middle managers type watch. I don't associate it with professional diving watch like you might do with the Submariner and Comex, or like the Citizen that has the depth reader on it, the Aqualand that has the depth reader on that was used by special forces and things like that. I associate those as actual dive watches, but I don't associate the Seamaster 300. I associate it more with a desk divers.
That's interesting. So see, the social component changed your perspective on a very capable dive watch, because the Omega Seamaster has its own design and own legacy, and it is those design choices were considered in the original design that you're saying is, well, that's just a mid-manager's watch.
Yeah, and I think about the Speedmaster as well, whereas I bought my Speedmaster because I did love that NASA connection, but that wasn't a lot of the selling points when I bought my Speedmaster, which was 2003-ish or something. I bought it off eBay for a good price. They were known as, not even that people knew about watches had them, but they were known as a sort of an engineer's watch, a technical person's watch. They don't lean so much on that now. They lean more on the ambassadors like George Clooney and then the special anniversary ones. I don't think they have that association that I liked about them, which is this is a tool for time measurement. They have more of this is now a luxury. They were always expensive, but now I think they've gone like way over what I would, brand new. They've gone like way over what I think.
They are definitely just skyrocketing up the price chart. And it seems like this constant battle actually with Rolex to like, they want to be a Rolex.
Yeah, and Rolex don't do this. I always think about this, and this is probably an episode in itself as well, is that if there is this world that we perceive where Omega is trying to compete directly with Rolex, and maybe another brand is trying to compete directly as that top spot, is I don't understand then why they don't play by the same game. Omega don't play the same game as Rolex do in terms of having your bread and butter collection, building up. They have the Olympics and stuff like that, but they also have, sometimes it's hard to understand the Omega collection and how it kind of comes together, whereas Rolex, I think, I would argue, has the most easy to understand collection of anything. Oh, there's a pilot watch. This is the watch you have if there's a diver. This is the watch if you like the diver but you want to show off a little bit more. This is that watch, the Deep Sea. They've got this is the ladies' dress watch. This is the men's dress watch or sports watch, you could say, for the date just. Oh, this is a chronograph watch. This is one for yacht racing. Their lines are very easily defined. Whereas I don't think a lot of other brands are perhaps as concise with how their collection fits in. A Rolex, for anybody walking into a shop, doesn't need the sales explanation, whereas Omega, each watch needs some kind of explanation about why it is or what it does or how it existed or who it's aimed at. It's how I think of them.
You make a really interesting analogy, and it's a business choice, and it's one of my favorite television personalities is actually Gordon Ramsay. And one of his keys to success when he goes into a restaurant is that if they've got that menu that opens up and it's page after page after page, no good. Focus here on what you're really great at, and you will be very successful. And what you just described, that's what Rolex is doing. They've got the feature menu. This is it. Whereas Omega is doing we have 14 different variations of a taco. We have 16 versions of a shish kebab, and that may be what's holding them back a little bit. That's an excellent thought. I had never considered it that way.
Well, the restaurant one, that's a great analogy, isn't it? Because most people remember a restaurant for one thing that they do really well that they like, oh, this is a great place for a burrito, or, oh, this is a great place for this or that. They don't, unless you go into the Ponderosa or a buffet, that not a lot of people like, oh, I go because they've got 1,000 options on the menu. That's not why you go, unless you go to a buffet for that, if you like to have a little bit of everything. But there's a place near me that has amazing tacos, and they just do tacos, and that's it, and they're really good at it.
Yeah, that's a whole different perspective. I don't think we've ever touched on is what is the issue between Omega and Rolex on that front.
Yeah, because it's almost like a different type of flexing, isn't it? Rolex is flexing, oh, I've got the money for this, oh, I'm flexing. But the perception is that people buy a Rolex because they're flexing for the most part, which I actually don't agree with, because I know a lot of people that love Rolex, like I do, love Rolex for the fact that the watches are great, like the bracelets. Same with Tudor, best in the business. Like Omega can't even come close with a bracelet after 150 years or whatever. But yet the Omega's more of a flex about the technical capabilities of it, or the
specifications.
The specifications of it, the coaxial movement and things like that, which I think is interesting.
You just described one of those early watch collecting mistakes and how it changes, though, because people immediately like, oh, Rolex, and then there's this really funny drop off where people are like, oh, I hate Rolex, they're this, they're that, and then you start to appreciate why Rolex is so successful and what makes them they're not the best watch ever made. They're not the most expensive watch ever made. They just make a high quality product over and over again that you can trust, and it will last you a lifetime. And then you suddenly are like, oh, I really do like that brand. So that's one of those learning curves.
I think this is totally correct. I think of it as when I'm describing Rolex to people who, I think most just average people who aren't into watches think Rolex is like the most expensive watch you can get, which it's far from it. It's middle. And I always describe it as Rolex. It has two markets: either somebody who doesn't know anything about watches but just wants a nice watch, or somebody that knows a lot about watches and appreciates the history and the movement technology and the cases and the bracelet. If you've got a little bit of knowledge about it, that's when you tend to be like not really bothered. And I was in that position. Knew enough to be dangerous about watches when I started this channel, so I was like, oh, why would I buy a Rolex when I can get a very similar watch in terms of specification and prestige and stuff? And it was only as I got more and more into the hobby that I started appreciating Rolex for what it was, or for who they are, I should say.
Totally.
But there's definitely, I think people think that Rolex is expensive, but I think incrementally Omega's put its prices up more than Rolex. I think if you could get a Rolex at retail, and also when you see, I went on a cruise where they had pre-owned Rolexes in, and what they were selling was not the pre-owned Rolex, they busted out the bezel with diamonds. So they were selling the diamonds is what they were selling. And there was a ladies' date just there, $10,000 that from the 90s that any day of the week you could get them on Chrono 24 for probably 2,000 or 3,000. So I think that's also adds to the prestige as well of when you see them, the vintage ones in stores, you think that the vintage ones are actually quite valuable, especially the ladies' ones, when in most cases they can be quite affordable.
Well, and they keep having their price hikes. I think they had a 14% hike this year, which was like, where did that come from? You know, I thought the supply chains were all back on, everything was going well, but they just keep putting those prices up. It seems almost arbitrarily.
Maybe they're seeing the fact that the supply chain is now freeing up. And because that wasn't them, was it real? I mean, they got a lot of the blame for the supply chain shortage, and maybe there was some restriction there, but I think actually just the demand had gone up for them massively, hadn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then the final one we had here that I don't know if I know enough knowledge to really talk about this subject in depth, but I think it is one that's, for most people that don't know this, that Swiss made doesn't actually mean Swiss made like American made does. American made, to say that, to have that label, everything comes from America, is sourced from America and created in America and assembled, which is why Shinola got themselves in a ridiculous legal fight with the FTC about saying made in Detroit when obviously they were just assembled. This is Swiss made doesn't mean Swiss made.
We looked it up before, and what it is that at least 60% of the watch's production costs must be incurred in Switzerland. Well, that leaves a lot of room. Production costs in Switzerland, meaning I'm assuming the labor, the people, is going to be exponentially higher in Switzerland than it's going to be in China. But the parts can be sourced fairly inexpensively. And I'm not going to say if they're from China, who knows, but from other places in the world, as opposed to producing the parts. As long as they get assembled, I mean, I don't know where the line draws, but you could definitely have that parts to human labor. You could hit 60%, I think, pretty easily and have the watch almost nothing made, nothing Swiss made, except the putting together of it. I think that could actually happen.
Yeah, and the reason why they still have Swiss made is because it still has that prestige, doesn't it? You still assume, and most people that don't know about watches at least know that quality watches come from Switzerland, don't they?
I'm a little bit of a Swiss watch snob myself. Like when I see that, I do automatically assume I'm getting a higher quality product. That may or may not be true. I don't know. There have been a number of long-term production issues from some Swiss manufacturers. One I'm trying to think of is I'm not sure if it's not, you can cut it out, but is the Sellita SW200 movement. I believe that's a Swiss movement, correct?
Yes, yeah, they certainly assemble them in Switzerland. Yeah, Sellita's Swiss-based and obviously ETA as well.
And that 200 has had, I don't know that they've still fixed that rotor issue. It seems like an inherent flaw that can't even get corrected. And it becomes sort of this barrier like, well, if that watch has that movement in it, I'm not sure I'm interested. So it is interesting that we do put a lot of stock in that, but it's not necessarily, I don't know, warranted anymore in 2025.
I think this is why it's good when you have measured by COSC and things like that, where they actually test the movements after they've been created. But I know Sellita has quite a high production quality, but I think the COSC, I like a watch that is measured to COSC or they've been tested by COSC. But it's always funny. I remember in the UK, I don't know whether this was a phenomenon, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, but a lot of the supermarkets bought out premium ranges to their food. There would be like Taste the Difference, I think, with Sainsbury's, and then Marks and Spencer's was known for doing this, where they would have a standard, say it was a sausage roll, they would have a standard sausage roll you could buy, and then they would have the luxury version as well, and people would more often than not buy it because it was a little bit more. But it always used to amuse me that you're paying more for them to make the food properly.
Oh, right.
The luxury is how they should make it. They were, we use all real butter and pastry that's been made with real flour. And okay, well, isn't that how it's supposed to be done? For example, why I mention it is the COSC thing when it's measured to COSC. It's like, we measure it to COSC and it's within, I think it's -4 +6 or something. That's the tolerance. Okay, well, if I'm paying $1,000 for a watch, I would expect that the company that I'm buying it on would do that. Why would they send it to another? COSC don't regulate the watches as far as I understand. They just measure, I think it's done like microchips where they get a whole batch of movements and then they measure each one to see if it performs to that. And then they approve remove that. I don't think they're actually regulating it, although I'm happy to be corrected on that if anyone knows better. You think, well, okay, well, if I'm paying this is what actually puts me off Doxer a little bit, is that they don't, even on their high-end stuff, they don't have Kosk, or they don't make any Seiko, again, Seiko don't do this. They don't put anything in there to say, hey, you're investing $5,000 in this watch. We invested 2 days in making sure that this watch is regulated, like Rolex do. They regulate, I don't know if it's 6 months or something they regulate their movements for. They're not willing to put the effort into regulating the movement or testing the movement themselves. There is micro brands that do this. Jack Mason, even though they're using Japanese Miyota movements, which most companies wouldn't regulate that. Jack Mason do go to the time and effort to regulate the Miyota movements to plus or minus 5 seconds, and they stand by that. That's one thing I found really weird when I started collecting mechanical watches.
I do feel the same, except that I understand why it is the way it is. If you're manufacturing at a large scale, like a Seiko, the cost to try to regulate every other one, they would probably rather just wait for someone to complain about a bad one and fix that one, as opposed to do that on every single one. And I think on Kosk, it was something like France said, I think it only costs them like $50 to get that certification. But for a watch manufacturer, that is another chink in the process, another time suck, and another thing that I've got to go, okay, well, I need to mark that up X to cover my costs of having that Kosk certified, and it changes the cost structure of the watch. Now, you're right, they could regulate it. I think it just depends. I think that's just a labor to output algorithm that has to be sorted, because I don't think everybody has the time and the resources to do that.
Yeah, you're right. And I think even though it is affordable to do it in comparison, it still takes a number of weeks to get it done. And if you're producing high volumes of it, but I think that's also one of the interesting things about luxury watches as well, is sometimes the movements that you go for is what, when you start out collecting it, you think, oh, that's what I'm paying for. But I think a Sellita SW200 is in the $250 to $300 price range at cost. And they could be in watches multiple thousands. Same with the NH35A, the TMI Seiko-owned company. They go into a lot of watches, and that movement is only $30, I think, which is amazing for a mechanical movement. But you'll see it in watches that are $400, $500, $600.
Yeah, I did a quick Google search, and it's actually $150 to $250 for that Sellita movement. So yeah, it's not a cheap movement by any means, and they're solid. They're solid, but I don't know. I hate to beat up on them. I had one of the watches that had that problem, and it really frustrated me. So, and you go online and you hear all these other stories of people having that same problem, and you go, why are they letting this go out of the factory at such a volume? That seems like a cost loser to the company, to have that many failures, because I don't hear that many failures with a Seiko or something else. So I found it interesting.
Do you want to mention the problem? Because I've never experienced this, but maybe it's because I have a lot of Sellita in like Christopher Ward. So maybe there's a QC that's happening.
No, mine was a Christopher Ward. So what happens, I think they call it the reverser gear, and it's a little fix, but what'll happen is you'll have the watch, and after a while, you'll hear it making a noise, almost like it's grinding a little bit internally. And then when you go to wind it, you'll feel the rotor spin. The rotor is not flowing independently of the winding mechanism, and eventually everything just locks up. You want to get it serviced before it gets to that point, because then it's a whole other issue. The upside of Christopher Ward, obviously, is they have that 5-year warranty. So I was able to send it and had it repaired. But in my gut, I'm going, man, if I'm Christopher Ward, I know the guy fixing these is not cheap, right? And the shipping, express DHL is not cheap, and there's just all these costs that they're absorbing every time on a $150 movement, or we'll say it's $200 movement. We'll make it the average. That you'd go like, I wish that wasn't happening at an exponential rate. You would like this to be a very rare occurrence, but if you spend any time on watch forums, you'll run across dozens of people who are facing that issue, which is frustrating. Now, if you get a Christopher Ward that has the SW300 movement in it, you got to win. That's a great movement. That is a high grade movement, and I haven't heard anybody have a single problem with it. It's just that one movement has an inherent issue that you feel. It seems like someone would go, we gotta nip this in the bud.
That is interesting. I've had a lot of watches with the Sleater SW200. Definitely something to keep an eye out, because I do own and review quite a lot of watches that have the SW200 in. So, well, guys, that was just a few that we could come up with, but we're definitely interested in knowing what you think. Hopefully you're enjoying the podcast. We would love a thumbs up on your favorite podcasting app of choice. If you want to give us some feedback or a comment, question, concerns you'd like us to read out on the show, don't forget to email us over at thecasualwatchreviewer@gmail.com. We look forward to seeing you next time on Casual Watch Talk. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye, everybody.